The king of rock and roll, Elvis Presley. No other name is more familiar or more iconic throughout the world. When he died at age 42, it was undeniable that Elvis's legacy would live on. But no one predicted the massive fame and fortune that would cultivate and spread over the decades following his death.
Elvis Presley was a massive star when he died. His star had reached mythological proportions.
Not realizing the infinite impact his image and music would have, Elvis simply wanted to leave his legacy to his only child, Lisa Marie Presley.
And the potential for merchandising and everything else after he passes away could make that astronomical. To give that all to a 25-year-old is a little frightening.
But like so many who die suddenly, Elvis didn't put a lot of thought into who should be in charge of his incredible estate.
It's beyond insulting to Elvis and his memory, and it's a terrible deal for the family.
What Elvis had that many people today don't have is pure, raw talent. And I think that that's something that he's going to always be remembered for.
The fame, the fortune, the legacy of Elvis Presley. Parker manages to broker a contract for Elvis by having RCA buy out his contract from Sun Records for a total of $35,000 plus unpaid royalties of $5,000.
This deal took 15 days to hammer out, and $35,000 was a lot of money, especially for an up-and-comer who had never gotten a contract before. In today's dollars, that would be about $350,000.
This was really RCA taking a big chance because Elvis was unknown. He didn't fit into any traditional music categories, so they really were rolling the dice with this deal. And Colonel Tom Parker knew this was a really big step in Elvis's career, and this was going to expose him nationally and internationally to whole new levels. It was going to be very, very lucrative for Elvis and, of course, for Colonel Tom Parker as well.
The RCA contract launches a formal partnership between Elvis and Tom Parker. Elvis replaces Bob Neal with Parker as his manager and agrees that Parker will take 25% of his earnings. It's a huge gamble for RCA, and Elvis's father signs the contract since Elvis is considered a minor. Elvis privately keeps Bob Neal on as an advisor, paying his 15% commission out of his own pocket.
Nobody called Elvis anything other than generous, especially if you were in his inner circle. He really took care of you.
Colonel Parker now has the green light to expand Elvis's career. He sets his sights on building a fortune that will benefit them both. In January of 1956, Elvis records the single Heartbreak Hotel. And on March 23, 1956, just 3 years after he's finished high school, he releases his first album.
It rose to the top of the charts and sold more than 300,000 copies in its initial release, which was a record for RCA.
Elvis is the hottest thing around, and Hollywood comes calling. Elvis has always idolized James Dean and Marlon Brando and fantasized about acting in films. He signs a contract with Paramount Pictures for one movie at $15,000, but with the option of 6 more. The payment would increase by $5,000 per film.
This was another groundbreaking deal. I mean, to do a movie deal of this size with Paramount for a musician, it was really unheard of.
In fact, between 56 and 69, he starred in 30 movies. And in today's dollar, with all the revenue from those movies, that would be about $1 billion.
Right away, the Colonel arranges a similar deal at 20th Century, ensuring that Elvis will be seen in 4 Hollywood movies. For the next 10 years, Parker will play one studio off the other to ensure Elvis has steady. The money is rolling in, and Elvis's father, Vernon, is in charge.
It's very interesting that Elvis chose his father to manage all of his money. This was an unsophisticated individual, his dad. So it's very surprising he didn't pick someone who was used to dealing with hundreds of thousands of dollars. But on the other hand, he trusted his dad. And in the entertainment business, trust is a huge item that you just can't pay someone for.
Elvis's first film for 20th Century, Love Me Tender, first appears November 15, 1957 in New York's Times Square. His fee is $100,000. It's a box office smash and recoups its $1 million budget in only 3 days. His second film, Loving You, made for Paramount, is actually contracted earlier for the modest sum of $15,000. But after the success of Love Me Tender, the Colonel brings the studio back to the table and negotiates a $50,000 increase for a total fee of $65,000.
Colonel Tom Parker really was a bit of a con man and a hustler, and maybe a bit is being kind here, because he used these really aggressive negotiating tactics, which of course paid off for Elvis at times, but really cost him at other times.
But just before Christmas, he gets a shock. He's been drafted.
Now, obviously, you'd think that Elvis, with all his money and influence, could get out of being drafted if he really wanted to.
But he didn't. In fact, the Colonel originally didn't like the idea, but then he thought this might actually help Elvis's public image.
And reportedly, Colonel Tom Parker really had to talk Elvis into this. He was worried about being out of the public eye for 2 years when he was in the Army.
In April of 1961, Elvis plays a concert in Hawaii and stays on for the filming of another formulaic movie musical, Blue Hawaii. He's yearning for meteor roles, but the money is good. On top of his more than $150,000 per picture fee, the Colonel has renegotiated the deals to include bonuses and 50% of all profits on some films.
It was unheard of at the time for a star to have that much power and draw that they could actually get 50% of the net back end of the movie deals.
But he was called Elvis the Pelvis. I mean, this was Elvis after all.
Well, if anyone can do it, the king can. But the real interesting wrinkle here is that it's 50% of the net profits. So what does that mean in Elvis's pocket at the end of the day? It could all be eaten up with cost and percentages and fees and side deals. So maybe it wasn't so lucrative as everybody thought.
It's estimated Elvis's generosity cost him $2 million annually during his lifetime.
I mean, he should have just opened up his own Cadillac dealer and he could have been the best customer. I mean, it's crazy how he was spending like this.
He also buys another house in Beverly Hills for $400,000.
Well, of course, he's a movie star. You gotta have a $400,000 house in Beverly Hills.
At 78 million records sold, Elvis is the highest paid entertainer in the world.
And in fact, he was the highest single taxpayer in the entire country.
It's a month-long engagement at $125,000 a week, beginning July 31st, 1969.
$125,000 was unheard of at the time. That would be about $800,000 today.
But it came with a price tag. Parker pressures Elvis to agree to a 50-50 partnership, doubling his already large percentage. Unlike the previous gentleman's agreement, this one is put in writing, but kept secret.
There was some egregious double-dipping going on here, so it's not like Colonel Tom Parker was satisfied with how much money he had already been bringing in from Elvis. He had to start taking from Elvis's side, too, so he actually makes more money from merchandising than Elvis does.
That's crazy, but you know, this could have been to support his gambling habit. Supposedly, the Colonel gambled up to $1 million a night, so Elvis was his cash cow.
It's July 31st, 1969, 13 years after his first show in Vegas bombed.
That night for Elvis was one where he was both nervous but also anxious to go out and prove himself to the crowd. The crowd was just electric with anticipation for Elvis to come out on stage. He came out on stage and knocked it out of the park. Everybody knew that the king was back.
After 10 standing ovations, a triumphant Elvis returns to his penthouse suite and phones the hotel manager. To celebrate his return to big live shows, he orders 30 diamond-studded Rolex watches for the boys. Then he calls the local Cadillac dealer and orders 14 cars, one for each of his closest friends back in Memphis.
Generosity is one thing, but this is something else. This does not make financial sense at all.
Elvis and Priscilla separate on February 23, 1972, and divorce amicably the following year, agreeing to share custody of Lisa Marie.
When Elvis Presley was divorcing Priscilla, they had reached a verbal settlement so that Priscilla would receive $100,000 in cash. But Priscilla's lawyers convinced her that Elvis was really worth more. So eventually she received $750,000 in cash, as well as half the income from each of their 3 California properties that were sold.
There was huge pent-up demand worldwide for people to see Elvis Presley live, especially in Europe. But Colonel Parker never let Elvis Presley tour outside the country except for a few shows in Canada.
In fact, supposedly Elvis was offered a multi-million-dollar Australian tour, which Parker turned down. In addition, he was offered $28,000 to perform in London.
Yeah, the story was that Tom Parker said he was from West Virginia, but he was really born in the Netherlands.
And if he had traveled abroad, he would have had to apply for a passport. I don't think Colonel Parker wanted to apply for a passport. As a result, Elvis Presley could never go and fulfill those dreams to tour the world.
And that really cost Elvis all of these lucrative opportunities.
2 days after Presley's death, while his body is lying in state at Graceland, Parker approaches Vernon, who is executor of his son's estate.
Vernon Presley says that Colonel Tom Parker approached him and said, now that Elvis is dead, there are going to be pirates and scam artists coming after you, so you've got to sign over to me, and I'll help protect you.
Parker came to Vernon knowing he had a serious heart condition, and he told him handling the estate would put too much stress on him, so he should really turn it over to Parker.
So Parker had him sign a document that let him continue to manage the income, just like he did when Elvis was alive. Now, this was certainly underhanded and unethical, but it probably wouldn't have violated any laws at the time.
Today, of course, it probably would have. Now we have laws to protect the exploitation of vulnerable individuals. There's fraud, undue influence, and this was a case where Vernon definitely needed protection from Colonel Parker.
Elvis's heirs were in for a major surprise when his net worth was calculated. At the time of his death, the man who should have been the richest entertainer of all time was valued at just under $5 million.
This was a stunning revelation to the family. Elvis, after all, was the only performer to earn $1 billion in revenue over a 25-year career for music, merchandising, films, recordings, concerts, Vegas. You name it, Elvis earned it, and now there's almost nothing left in comparison.
But when you take a look at his lavish spending during his lifetime, buying gold-plated handguns for his entourage, paying Colonel Parker all of that money, it's not surprising.
Elvis's will, written in March 1977, had appointed his father, Vernon Presley, as executor and trustee. The beneficiaries of the trust are Vernon, Elvis's grandmother, Minnie Mae Presley, and his 9-year-old daughter, Lisa Marie Presley. The will states that Vernon may, at his discretion, give money to other family members as needed.
He appoints his dad as executor. That in and of itself is not so interesting. But what is interesting is that he gives his dad the right to appoint an alternate executor should something happen to him. This is very unusual in estate planning.
It's especially unusual because Vernon Presley, of course, is older than Elvis. So normally when somebody does a will, they're going to name backups and alternatives and not rely on an older person to be the executor and to give the older person that much power to name the successor, because it also exposes that person to the possibility of being taken advantage of, like we saw with Colonel Tom Parker.
The other interesting thing about Elvis's will is that Lisa Marie, his daughter, receives everything at the age of 25. Now, even though he only passed away with $5 million, that money grows over time, and the potential for merchandising and everything else after he passes away could make that astronomical. To give that all to a 25-year-old is a little frightening.
Vernon passes away in 1979, and Minnie Mae dies a year later. By 1980, Lisa Marie is the sole beneficiary of the estate, and Lisa Marie's mother, Priscilla Presley, becomes the trustee. In order to ensure a steady income for the estate, upon Elvis's death, Colonel Tom Parker sets up a licensing operation to produce Elvis merchandise and souvenirs. But once taxes and Parker's 50% are deducted, the estate earns less than $1 million a year. And by this point, the cost of running Graceland is estimated at $500,000 a year.
There had to be more funny business going on. There is no way with merchandising and the type of dollars that could be brought in that the estate was pocketing so little. Again, it's Colonel Tom Parker pulling strings and lining his own pocket.
It turns out that in 1973, Colonel Parker had advised Elvis against joining organizations that would manage copyright and royalties. Instead, Parker had turned it all over to RCA for a one-time buyout fee of $5.4 million, a fraction of their worth. This had made Elvis and his estate ineligible for millions of dollars in royalty payments. It's a shocking revelation.
This sounded like a terrible deal for Elvis. Songwriters at the very least usually get 50% royalties, and this was a one-time check, which sounds good, but I think Colonel Parker was just doing it out of his own self-interest, as you said, to line his pockets.
To make matters worse, while Elvis's estate did get a share of the royalties, it was capped at 50 cents per record, so as prices went up and his records sold for more, Elvis's estate didn't share in any of that.
And yet after Vernon's death, Priscilla asks the Colonel to carry on representing and managing the estate. It needs to be approved by the Shelby County Probate Court.
It's shocking that Priscilla would go back to the Colonel and ask him to be involved in managing the estate. This is the individual who had taken larger percentages than was typical at the time, and even now. And here she is going back to him, asking him to continue staying involved in the estate.
Thankfully, the probate judge realized that there may be a problem here, so he appointed an independent attorney to look into this.
Disconcerted by how much of Elvis's income Parker had taken while Elvis was alive, and amazed that the estate wished to continue the arrangement, presiding judge Joseph Evans appoints attorney Blanchard E. Toole to investigate Parker's compensation agreement and to represent and defend the interests of Lisa Marie Presley.
It's shocking that Parker would receive 50% to manage an artist that isn't even alive.
It was very prudent for the probate judge to want to investigate that, and that's really not an unusual measure. When the probate judge thinks something funny is going on, to investigate it, especially when you've got a minor to protect.
4 months later, a 300-page report from Toole states that charging a 50% commission compared to the industry average of 15 to 20% is extortionate.
In Toole's words, Parker violated his duty both to Elvis and the estate.
Toole reported how the commissions were unreasonable and excessive, and he had a big problem with Colonel Tom Parker.
During a second, more detailed investigation, it comes out that all earnings were paid directly to the trust instead of Parker. And with the IRS now demanding almost $10 million in inheritance taxes, the estate is facing bankruptcy. 2 weeks after receiving the report, Judge Evans comes down hard on Colonel Parker. He orders the co-executors to sue him for fraudulent business practices. Colonel Parker's cut increased from 40% to 56% after Elvis's death, with only 22% going to the estate.
Colonel Tom Parker had a lot of street smarts. He knew he was going to be left out in the cold, and that's why he approached Vernon Presley to get him to sign this new deal so he could try to hold on to that cash cow.
The report argues that all agreements with Elvis Presley terminated on his death. It also concludes that Elvis lost millions because of Parker's lack of business savvy, including his failure to organize Presley's finances to help minimize his taxes. And it recommends the Presley estate should end all deals with Parker, and that Parker should be forced to repay whatever he has earned from Elvis since his death. Lisa Marie and Priscilla agree, suing the Colonel in June 1982 and ending all contracts with him. And Colonel Parker responds in character. He countersues. But 4 months later, things are settled out of court, with Elvis's estate paying $2 million to buy Colonel Parker out. With Graceland and the mansion costing over $500,000 a year in maintenance and taxes, Lisa Marie is faced with having to sell. But Priscilla and the executors have an idea. Why not make Graceland a museum? Graceland opens its doors to the public June 7, 1982. Only 2 weeks later, Colonel Parker calls the family with some surprising news. Parker reveals he has a large collection of Elvis memorabilia, including newspaper clippings, originals of every record Elvis ever released, and some of the original costumes and programs, all meticulously cataloged and waiting for a proper place to be viewed. He also has Elvis's 1957 gold lame suit, arguably the most iconic rock outfit in history. He offers up the entire collection, a whopping 35 tons of material for $2 million.
I don't think the Colonel was exactly extending an olive branch. It was more likely that he was hard up for cash.
This isn't a guy who's been generous to Elvis in the past, and the big question is, how did he get all this stuff? I mean, did he take it when he wasn't supposed to? So maybe $2 million was a good deal for him because he never should have had the stuff to begin with.